So looking in the Cumberland system, if we look at the way there in the old UI, the way that we used to do this before the new UI, it was a lot of manual coding and data that you had to add into. So all this, everyone had to start from basically nothing. And you could see, you had to basically call out all your fields, and then you had to go in and do any mappings and then any lookups or however you needed to do it, if-then statements. All of this had to be added from scratch. So I would always copy. I would always copy from a previous customer and then start configuring it and, make sure that added any custom fields and so forth. So it's quite a bit of an effort to build this from scratch. It's one big long form in the old UI, which didn't make it easy as well. And it also is quite intimidating to customers when they look at this. In the new UI, they've changed it quite a bit and made it much more user-friendly. They've split the form into 3 different pieces. The credentials piece, which is the sign-in and the single sign-on pieces. There is the automate, where this is where you can schedule it to run up to 10 times a day, and then you can determine who those logs go to after a successful run or after an error happens. And then the mapping page. So the mapping page looks a lot different than we just showed here. So if I look at, for example, users, they give you kind of a starting piece, and then from there you can, so it's probably hard to tell, but you can see this is kind of gray and this is kind of black. The gray is what they give you to start with. So every customer that gets this enabled kind of has some mappings, base mappings already set up. And then from there, if you need to go in and change it, you can go in and update it. Some of it you can't update. So you can see here it's all grayed out. I can't delete it. I can't turn it off. It's because it is absolutely required and they don't want you messing with it. So they kind of give that to you as well. But then you can see them up in here and you can add in all of this is information that I added, like setting an initial only password, being able to mark this as initial only. The one challenge that's always been between OpenAir and NetSuite is the data structure is completely different. So in OpenAir, when you create a drop-down list, it's text fields, and in NetSuite, those list views you create have an ID tied to them. So when you try to map a list field in OpenAir value with a drop-down in NetSuite and a drop-down in OpenAir, you have to do some data manipulation. Also, when you are storing like cost center data where it's an ID in OpenAir and an ID in NetSuite, you need to be able to pull the IDs. You also have to do a little bit of coding there. So these lookups are really handy. So what this lookup does is it's looking up the cost center ID. It's going to set the cost center ID by looking up the NetSuite department name, and then it's going to look up in the cost center table. It's going to find the name of the department. It's going to find that name. It's going to pull the NetSuite ID, and then it's going to look up the OpenAir ID, and that's what's going to get used to set. So this lookup is basically taking the name of the field, as long as the name is the same in NetSuite and OpenAir. And then in the OpenAir table, I've created a custom field to store the ID on the record. So for anything like department, cost center, services, where you can store the NetSuite ID, it makes the lookup real simple. So now if they create a new department in NetSuite and they say create it in OpenAir, all I've got to do is create it in OpenAir, get the NetSuite ID, and then store it in that custom field. And I never have to go into this lookup and make any changes. So as long as that ID is there, this will always work. So it makes the maintenance of this much simpler. So this is like sorry. I don't want to mess anything up here. Here I'm hard coding a field. So this is a user record for employees. So I'm hard coding this user type field to employee. So you can also hard code in this data. So you'll see here what I'm pushing over is users and clients, projects. So here's another one that I run into quite a bit, being able to concatenate. So in this case, they wanted to concatenate the name of the project and the OpenAir internal ID. So the way I did this, and they're creating projects from Boomi into OpenAir, then we're exporting that project into NetSuite, and I'm setting the OpenAir internal ID in a custom field. And then when NetSuite pushes that project update back into OpenAir to update the project, I'm putting a concatenation that's concatenating the name of the project to the cust entity field we created to store the internal ID and the name, and that's the way that we get the concatenation back. So actually when it comes into OpenAir, it doesn't have an ID in the name, but then when it goes to NetSuite and comes back, it gets set. And so that's how we're setting the name. Let's see, so that's projects. Services are obviously needed, expense items, vendors. So this would basically where in the NetSuite system you would create what they call individual vendors. And if you want those in OpenAir so they can log in and enter time, then you have a separate mapping for vendors than you do for employees, although they all end up as users in OpenAir. But you can see here where I hard code custom field in OpenAir with contractors, so the system is, you can tell which is a contractor and which is an employee.
Can you control the direction from this UI as well?
Yeah, so the arrows show the direction, so it's NetSuite data to OpenAir data using these arrows.
And you can flip it?
You cannot flip it. Some of this is pre-baked, so you have to live with the direction.
Uh-huh.
Now, with the three-way integration enabled, it allows you to actually create clients and projects in OpenAir and push them to NetSuite. There's a trick to that. The client and the project have to have a Salesforce ID because this was completely built for customers that were integrating Salesforce with OpenAir using the old Salesforce OpenAir integration and then wanting to push those clients and projects from OpenAir to NetSuite. So in this customer, they're actually integrating from Salesforce using Boomi. So we're setting the Salesforce ID, obviously, on the OpenAir record, which now enables them to be able to push the project and the customer from OpenAir to NetSuite. So there's also a way to do this without Salesforce. So I've implemented this quite a bit for customers that say, we don't want to rely on, we don't have a CRM, and we don't want to rely on finance to create the project. PS wants to create the project, but PS doesn't have access to NetSuite. So in OpenAir, what I've done there is there's that that SFID field, and I've just repurposed it as a sequence field. So every time they create a project, the SFID becomes just a number. It doesn't matter what the value is as long as there's a value. And so as long as that SFID has a value, which it will using a sequence field, then you can still create projects and customers in OpenAir and then push them to NetSuite. So it's just a way to get around the Salesforce integration piece. One thing I didn't note, with all these records, you can do filtering. So what I'm doing in this scenario is we're bringing in projects in a proposed stage, and so much prior to them hitting closed won. But we don't want those projects to go to NetSuite till they get to a certain stage. So we have stage 3 is in process and stage 6 is internal. So if they create a new internal project in OpenAir, we need it to push to NetSuite. If they create a new project in proposed stage, it gets moved to in process. Then once it hits that stage, it becomes eligible to export to NetSuite. So it's a way to be able to filter data out. This is similar to, Kim, what we've done with UL to be able to say only bring in data with this subsidiary IDs. So in order to add more stages or to add more data, we just have to come in here and update this filter to be able to add additional filter. And what always got me is strange with this filter, the way they built it, is it's a filter in, not a filter out. And I don't know about you, Andrea or Carter, but that always got me confused Because when I think of filtering, I think of what do I want not to hit. But in this scenario, it's what do I want to be able to go through. So even though it's a filter, it's saying any project with this is eligible. And if it doesn't have this, it's not eligible. And that always twisted my brain a bit.
Yeah, definitely.
Took some getting used to. So here we're doing clients and projects expense reports. Now there's two different expense report paths. If it's an employee creating an expense report, then you would send it over as an expense report to NetSuite, and it looks just like it was created directly in NetSuite, so it doesn't look any different. And then you can mark it as paid in NetSuite, and that reimbursement will come through and mark the expense report as reimbursed in OpenAir. But if it's a vendor, there's no such thing as an expense report in NetSuite for a vendor. So what happens with vendors is when they create an expense report and it gets approved, it gets exported. It actually creates a vendor bill payable to the vendor. And then when you apply a payment to that vendor bill to show that we're paying this vendor for this expense report, it gets also sent over and marks the expense report as paid. So it works the same way from a payment perspective, but they create different objects. So when you're creating your mapping, you have to map for both expense reports as well as vendor bills for making sure that you set any required fields so that when the expense report exports. And for example, for Greeley, they have required field for, they wanted to be able to mark, if it's not reimbursable, they wanted to be able to mark it so that when it comes in a NetSuite, it doesn't get set. So this is basically if the OpenAir status is in, then the field gets set to true, and same for the other. So this is a way to be able to make sure when it comes over as not.
I didn't think you could set that field, Ron. Previously, I think that was a limitation to be able to map to that reimbursable checkbox. But apparently it isn't. So.
No, you can do it. Yeah, I've done it before, and when I've forgotten to add it, it always screws up because it takes a non-reimbursable and shows that it's payable to the employee. So this is the code to get that done. Invoices come over. If you're doing a one invoice per project, you can actually come in here and pull data from the project. So in their scenario, they do one invoice per project, and I'm able to come in here. And this is where you can get pretty fancy. You know, it's saying if the project location, now this is just a drop-down field, if it equals Alabama, then they have location that they're using. So it'll set the location ID 1. So if they added a new location in NetSuite, we would need to add it to the drop-down, and then we would need to come in here and add another line. So we put every possible state, you know, all 50 states in here, so we don't have to keep maintaining this list. But this is, you know, these if-thens can get quite complicated, but they're a very powerful way to be able to get things mapped over.
You have to put them all in one line. That's one of the tricks. If you don't, it's going to wipe out some of your mappings.
Yeah.
And actually, I'll mention at SuiteWorld in the roadmap, one of the things they did talk about was they're actually going to be moving away from all of this advanced coding for filtering and criteria. So they're going to use, like, basically build it into the interface to use, like, drop-downs and stuff to set, like, logic and criteria and filtering. So I think that's the direction they're moving, which I think will make this even more user-friendly because you won't need to, like, know how to, like, write this code or this advanced mapping code to enter some of this stuff, which I think will be great.
Yeah, and Carter, to your point, you can have multiple lookups or multiple if-thens in the same area. So if I had other fields I wanted to map, you just can't set a value here. So as long as you leave this blank, you can have multiple if-thens for different field level data.
Okay.
Because here's one where, no, that's the same thing. This is looking up department. So here's a really fun one. So this one has two different, it's both setting department and location. And so these first ones are looking up, if it's looking up the project, pulling the project ID, looking up the cost center. If it's cost center 3, then set the department to 9. But then down here in this if then, it's looking at the location field and saying, and looking at the project on the charge, looking up the project, pulling the ID, pulling the value, and then determining which if then to follow. So you can see it here. This is, I always do these in Excel. It's much easier to be able to dump the data, ID matches, and then add these in Excel and then copy these into here. Because at the end of the day, this is really just a lot of complicated text.
Hey, Ron, you said you could run it up to 10 times a day. For Optimus, I actually set it to 12. The documentation says 20. You can do it up to 24 times a day. So
that must
do you know
have
why
changed.
that is? Yeah, it's weird. The documentation is 24. Optimus only let me go to 12. So I don't know what the answer is on that.
Well, we do know it'll go 12 then, right?
Yeah, we'll definitely go 12.
Okay. Well, shocking the documentation is not accurate. One other note here, they used to protect, there's optional features you can enable for different records, and used to all be hidden under this integration admin. So this is where you can decide, if you want to enable the 3-way integration, and what do you want to turn on and what do you want to turn off. And then they put a password in here which would ideally force people to have to go through support to be able to enable this stuff. Just an FYI, we have the password. It hasn't changed in years. So anytime I'm looking to update this form, I can just go ahead and do it, and then we have the password. So if you're looking to do this, just contact me. Carter, you have it too, don't you?
Yep.
Yeah. Andrea, did you know we had the password for this?
Yeah, I have it as well.
Yeah. Okay. So if you get on one of these projects, also you can do an exchange rate integration. If you're doing exchange rate in both systems and you want to sync them, that's an important thing for multi-global customers. But what they did was they left some of this as password protected. Other of this, let me come up here, they put here under the settings. So some of this is now actually available to be selected by the end user without having to go through support. So for example, if you wanted to be able to copy the expense policy from the template and you wanted that set, you could just turn that on so that when the template creates a project, it pulls in the policy duplication. So some of these they've deemed as available to the end user, and it's different for each object, has its own set of settings. Okay. So each of these is called a workflow, and as you've enabled them, you can come in here and add new workflows. If you wanted to turn something off, it's as simple as turning it off. One note, let's say that I wanted to do a bulk update of all the data out of NetSuite to bulk update a project. If you come in here and turn project path off and hit save and then turn it back on and hit save and run, it's going to basically refresh every project that's ever been synced from the beginning of time. So it's a way to force the system to do a complete refresh. This is really helpful if you create a new field and you wanted that you never mapped before, but you want to go ahead and get it added in one system or the other. You just basically turn this off, turn this on, save it, and then you can automatically just run this and it will automatically update every record without you having to do some sort of a bulk data load. Any questions? Okay. I don't have really anything else I wanted to show today unless someone wanted to see something specific. I don't know if this recorded or not. I'm getting this another login. I've been logged. Are you still there?
Yeah.
I think it did record because when I just joined, I joined about 15 minutes ago and it was saying that it was being recorded. So I think we're good.
Okay. Hey, Jody.
Hey.
All right. Well, no questions. Jody, while you were on, did you have anything you wanted to share with the team? Any opportunities or anything?
Well, Carter already probably told the good news about Optimus going live. So.
Indeed.
Yeah. Big project. By the way, so far they've spent over $100,000 with just us on this project. So the other big thing is